An American spy broke the most sacred rule of intelligence work, and it nearly destroyed him. Berlin, 1962. Jack Morrison had just received the order. His Soviet contact had been compromised. The KGB was closing in, and Washington's response was clear. Abandon him, let him die, standard procedure. But Morrison had given this man his word, a promise that he would be protected, that his trust would not be betrayed. So he made a choice that defied everything the CIA stood for. He spent his life savings. He operated without authorization. He risked an international incident. And when the shooting started at the Berlin Wall, he did something no intelligence officer should ever do. He stepped into the light. What happened next was captured in classified files that stayed buried for 50 years. A midnight escape, shots fired across the wall, and one sentence from Morrison's debriefing that haunts every intelligence officer who's ever read it. If we abandon those who trust us, we've already lost, not to the enemy, but to ourselves. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers around the world who share this passion for the hidden stories of history. And if you're drawn to these forgotten Cold War narratives, the moral choices, the buried truths, the human beings behind the secrets, subscribe now. Every day I bring you a story that textbooks left out, declassified just in time for us to finally understand what really happened. Jack Morrison wasn't supposed to be in Berlin. When he joined the CIA in 1956, fresh out of Yale with a degree in Russian literature, he imagined himself working behind a desk in Washington, translating intercepted communications, analyzing Soviet political journals, maybe briefing senior analysts on Khrushchev's speeches. He had studied Pushkin and Tolstoy because he loved the language, the depth of Russian thought, the way their writers captured the human soul in ways American literature rarely attempted. He never imagined he'd be using that knowledge to recruit Soviet intelligence officers in one of the most dangerous cities on Earth. But the agency had other plans. By 1960, Berlin had become the pressure point of the Cold War, a divided city where East met West, where espionage wasn't an abstract game played in embassy corridors, but a daily reality of safe houses, dead drops, and midnight crossings. The CIA needed Russian speakers who could operate in the field, who could think like their adversaries, who understood that intelligence work wasn't just about stealing secrets. It was about understanding the people who held them. Morrison arrived in West Berlin in January 1960, assigned to the Berlin operations base as a case officer. His job was straightforward on paper. Identify Soviet officials who might be vulnerable to recruitment, establish contact, assess their motivations, and if possible, turn them into assets for the United States. In practice, it meant learning to live with constant moral compromise. It meant befriending people so you could betray them or betray their government, depending on how you chose to frame it. It meant operating in a world where trust was currency and everyone was for sale, if you could find the right price. Morrison hated it. Not the work itself, but what it required him to become. His colleagues at the station noticed immediately. They called him the priest behind his back, not affectionately. In a profession that demanded ruthless pragmatism, Morrison carried himself with an almost anachronistic sense of honor. He asked too many questions about operations. He worried too much about the fate of assets after their usefulness expired. He treated sources like human beings instead of intelligence-gathering tools. His station chief told him bluntly, "Jack, you need to understand something. These people aren't your friends. They're not even your allies. They're means to an end. The day you forget, that is the day you become a liability." Morrison nodded. He filed the reports. He followed the protocols. But he never quite believed it. Then came Pyotr Volkov. It was April 1961, just weeks before the Bay of Pigs disaster would shake American confidence, and months before the Soviets would begin building the wall that would divide Berlin for a generation. Morrison received word through a trusted intermediary, a German shopkeeper who passed messages between both sides, that a Soviet officer wanted to make contact. Not for money, not for ideology, for something more complicated. They met in a workers' cafe in the French sector, a place where both Americans and Soviets occasionally appeared without raising immediate suspicion. Volkov was 43 years old, a mid-level KGB officer assigned to monitor East German communications. He had a forgettable face, exactly what you wanted in intelligence work, and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much. He ordered coffee and stared at it for a long moment before speaking. "I watched them kill an innocent man last month," Volkov said quietly in Russian. "A colleague. They accused him of passing information to the West. He wasn't. I knew he wasn't, but they needed someone to blame for a security failure, and he was convenient. So they shot him in the basement of our headquarters and told his wife he died of a heart attack." Morrison listened without interrupting. This was the moment that defined recruitment, when a potential asset revealed not just what they knew, but why they were willing to betray everything they'd been trained to protect. "I can no longer serve a system that murders truth," Volkov continued. "I'm not an idealist. I don't believe your system is perfect. But I cannot participate in this anymore. I need to know that what I've witnessed, what I've been part of, means something, that someone is keeping record of what we've become." Morrison looked at this tired Soviet officer across a scratched cafe table and made a decision that would eventually cost him everything. He reached across and shook Volkov's hand. "I give you my word," Morrison said. "We'll protect you." The recruitment of Pyotr Volkov followed all the proper procedures. Morrison filed his initial contact report, received authorization from Langley to proceed, and established the operational protocols that would govern their relationship. They met every 3 weeks in rotating safe houses across West Berlin, modest apartments the CIA maintained specifically for agent meetings, always in different neighborhoods, always approached from different directions, always with counter-surveillance measures in place. Volkov provided intelligence on Soviet military communications, KGB personnel movements, and East German security operations. Nothing earth-shattering, but reliable, verifiable, and occasionally quite valuable. But what made Volkov different, what made this operation feel different to Morrison, was the man himself. Most Soviet defectors or informants were motivated by a mixture of greed, ideology, resentment, or ego. They wanted money, or revenge, or validation, or the thrill of playing both sides. Volkov wanted none of those things. He accepted the modest payments the CIA insisted on providing, but Morrison suspected he donated most of it to East Berlin churches through anonymous drops. He never asked for special treatment or expressed interest in defecting. He simply wanted someone to know the truth, to document what the Soviet system was doing to its own people, to its own believers. During their meetings, after the intelligence debriefings were complete, they sometimes talked about literature. Volkov had studied engineering but loved Russian poetry, Akhmatova, Mandelstam, the voices that survived Stalin's purges by whisper and memory. Morrison would quote passages in Russian, and Volkov would smile with genuine pleasure, surprised that an American intelligence officer knew these forbidden verses by heart. It was a small thing, those literary discussions in safe houses designed for espionage, but it created something dangerous in their line of work: mutual respect, maybe even trust. Morrison's station chief warned him about it. "You're getting too close to this asset. I can see it in your reports, the way you describe him, the language you use. Remember what I told you. He's not your friend. If this operation goes bad, if he gets compromised, you need to be able to walk away without hesitation. That's the job." Morrison knew the chief was right. He tried to maintain professional distance. But there was something about Volkov's quiet dignity, his refusal to hate either his own country or the one he was betraying, that made detachment impossible. This wasn't a man playing games or seeking advantage. This was someone trying to remain human in a system designed to erase humanity. And Morrison recognized that struggle because he felt it himself. The constant tension between duty and conscience, between what the mission required and what his sense of right and wrong demanded. For 15 months, the operation ran smoothly. Volkov delivered solid intelligence. Morrison filed thorough reports. The bureaucracy was satisfied, and both men maintained the fiction that theirs was purely a professional relationship governed by operational necessity rather than any deeper human connection. Then came July 1962, and everything changed. Morrison arrived at the designated safe house for their scheduled meeting, a third-floor apartment near the Tiergarten, accessed through a back entrance that opened onto an alley. Standard protocol dictated arriving 15 minutes early to check for surveillance, ensure the location was secure, and prepare the space. Morrison followed every step perfectly. He saw nothing unusual, but Volkov did. The moment he entered the apartment, Morrison could see it in his eyes. Controlled panic, the look of a man who knows he's being followed but can't yet prove it. They went through the standard greeting, the coded phrases that confirmed neither was under duress. Then Volkov leaned forward and spoke barely above a whisper. "There was a man at the S-Bahn station. KGB, I'm certain of it. Not one of mine, someone from 2nd Directorate, counterintelligence. He made eye contact deliberately. He wanted me to know I'd been seen." Morrison felt his stomach tighten. This was the nightmare scenario every case officer feared. The moment when your asset realizes they're compromised. When the machinery of detection and arrest begins to move. When you have perhaps hours or days before everything collapses. He immediately activated the emergency protocol, a prearranged signal that meant abort all contact and await further instruction. "Go dark," Morrison told him. "Change nothing in your routine, but avoid all our usual contact points. I'll request immediate exfiltration authorization. We'll have you out within 48 hours. Volkov nodded slowly. Then he said something that would haunt Morrison for years afterward. "You gave me your word that I would be protected. I'm trusting that you meant it." Morrison met his eyes. "I meant it." Morrison returned to the Berlin operations base and filed an emergency cable to Langley. The language was precise, urgent, and followed protocol exactly. Asset compromised. Request: immediate exfiltration, authorization, window estimated 24 to 48 hours. He included Volkov's operational history, his intelligence contributions, and the tactical assessment that extraction was feasible if authorized quickly. Then he waited. The response came back within 6 hours. Morrison read it twice, certain he'd misunderstood, but the words remained the same. Exfiltration, request denied. Asset classified, low priority. Operational risk outweighs strategic value. Terminate contact, standard protocol, standard protocol. Those two words contained an entire philosophy of intelligence work. The cold calculus that measured human lives against mission objectives, that wrote off compromised assets the way accountants wrote off failed investments. Volkov had provided useful intelligence, but nothing critical enough to justify risking other operations or exposing CIA capabilities in Berlin. He knew the risks when he agreed to work with American intelligence. Now those risks had materialized. The agency owed him nothing beyond the payments already rendered. Morrison sat in his small office staring at that cable for a long time. Around him, the Berlin station continued its routine operations. Analysts reviewing intercepts, case officers planning meetings, secretaries typing classified reports. Normal work in an abnormal city. Everyone understood the rules. Assets got burned, sources got arrested. Sometimes they disappeared into Soviet prisons, sometimes worse. You documented it, you learned from it, and you moved on to the next operation. Sentiment was a luxury the Cold War couldn't afford. But Morrison kept hearing Volkov's voice. "You gave me your word that I would be protected. I'm trusting that you meant it." He thought about the man he'd recruited 15 months ago, a Soviet officer who'd watched his government murder an innocent colleague and couldn't stay silent. A man who risked everything not for money or ideology, but because he believed truth mattered more than survival. a man who quoted forbidden poetry in safe houses and spoke about conscience as if it were something real, something worth preserving even in a world designed to destroy it. Morrison had given his word. He'd looked Volkov in the eyes and promised protection. And now his own government was telling him that promise meant nothing, that operational convenience trumped personal honor, that walking away was not just acceptable, but required. He picked up the secure phone and called Tom Bradley, another case officer he'd known since training, someone he trusted completely. "Tom, if I go dark for 48 hours, tell them I had the flu. Tell them I was sick at my apartment and couldn't be reached. Can you do that?" There was a pause. Bradley understood immediately what Morrison was asking. Cover for an unauthorized operation, complicity in violating direct orders. "Jesus, Jack, you're really going to do this?" I gave him my word. Another pause. Then, 48 hours. After that, I can't help you. Morrison hung up and began planning an operation the CIA had explicitly forbidden. He couldn't use agency resources, no safe houses, no operational funds, no backup teams, no official channels of any kind. Everything would have to be improvised using his own money and contacts outside the intelligence apparatus. If he succeeded, the agency might overlook the insubordination. If he failed, they'd disavow him completely, and Volkov would be tortured for information before execution. The mathematics were simple and terrible. He was risking his career, his marriage, his entire future to save one Soviet intelligence officer the CIA had already written off as expendable. Any rational calculation said it was madness, but Morrison had spent 2 years in Berlin learning to think like a spy, to operate in moral gray zones, to accept necessary evils. And he'd discovered something about himself in the process. There was a line he couldn't cross, a point where duty to the mission collided with duty to his own conscience. Volkov trusted him. Volkov had risked everything based on a promise Morrison had made. And if that promise meant nothing, if he could walk away because headquarters said it was acceptable, then what did any of it mean? What was he protecting if not the very principle that a man's word should matter? That trust between human beings had to mean something even in the shadow world of espionage. Morrison opened his desk drawer and pulled out his personal checkbook. His savings account contained $8,000, money he and his wife had been setting aside for a house, the down payment on a future they'd been planning together. He wrote himself a check for the full amount. Then he went to find Hans Becker. Hans Becker operated a small auto repair shop in the Kreuzberg district, a working-class neighborhood where questions weren't asked and cash was the only currency that mattered. The shop was legitimate. Becker actually fixed cars, actually employed mechanics, actually paid taxes on the modest income his business generated. But everyone in the intelligence community knew what else Becker did. He moved people across the Berlin Wall, not for ideology or politics, but for money. He'd successfully smuggled 17 people from east to west in the past 18 months, using methods that changed with each operation, always adapting to new security measures, always one step ahead of the Stasi and KGB surveillance networks. Morrison found him in the back office, reviewing invoices. Becker looked up with immediate suspicion. He knew Morrison was CIA. Everyone in that world recognized everyone else, and he'd made it a strict policy never to work with intelligence agencies. Too many complications, too many hidden agendas, too much risk of being used in larger operations he didn't control. "Whatever you're about to ask, the answer is no," Becker said in German before Morrison could speak. Morrison sat down anyway. "I need to get someone out, a Soviet officer. He's compromised. The KGB is closing in, and my own agency has refused to help him." "Then why should I help you?" "Because I'm not asking as a CIA officer. I'm asking as someone who made a promise and intends to keep it. This isn't an official operation. There's no backup, no agency support, no paperwork. Just me trying to save a man who trusted my word." Becker studied him carefully. In his line of work, reading people meant the difference between success and a Stasi prison cell. He'd learned to spot desperation, deception, and hidden motives. What he saw in Morrison was something different, a kind of stubborn integrity that seemed almost foolish in their world of calculated betrayals. You understand what you're risking. If this goes wrong, your agency will disavow you. You'll lose everything: career, reputation, probably your freedom, for one Soviet spy. I understand. And you're willing to pay cash? No promises, no IOUs, no expecting favors later? Morrison placed an envelope on the desk. $8,000, my entire savings. It was supposed to be a down payment on a house. Becker opened the envelope and counted quickly. Then he looked at Morrison with something approaching respect. You're either the most honorable man I've ever met or the biggest fool. Possibly both. He tucked the money into his desk drawer. Tell me about your Soviet officer. Where is he now? What are his movement patterns? How much time do we have? For the next hour, they planned the extraction. Morrison used a coded message system to contact Volkov with instructions. Be at a specific location near the Oberbaumbrücke at midnight on August 15th, exactly 3 days away. The timing was crucial. Becker had identified a brief vulnerability in the security rotation at that section of the wall. A 7-minute window during shift change when surveillance coverage dropped and guards were distracted with handoff procedures. The plan was simple because simple plans had the best chance of success. Becker's team would create a diversion, a staged fight between apparently drunk workers that would draw immediate attention. While guards and spotlights focused on the disturbance, Volkov would move through a narrow gap in the security perimeter, a blind spot that existed only during those precious 7 minutes. Morrison would be waiting on the west side with forged identification papers and a car to take Volkov directly to the American sector. Everything depended on timing, luck, and Volkov's courage. If the KGB had already arrested him, the operation would abort before it started. If the security rotation changed, they'd walk into a trap. If Volkov hesitated or moved too slowly, the window would close with him still on the wrong side of the wall. One more thing, Becker said as Morrison prepared to leave. You need to understand something about this work. I've moved 17 people successfully, but I've also lost 4. 4 people who trusted me, who followed my instructions exactly, and still ended up dead or disappeared. The wall isn't just concrete and barbed wire. It's the most sophisticated security system the Soviets have ever built. Sometimes courage isn't enough. Sometimes keeping your word isn't enough. Sometimes people die despite your best intentions. Morrison met his eyes. I know, but I have to try. Then we try together. Midnight, August 15th. Let's hope your Soviet officer is as brave as you are foolish. August 15th, 1962. Morrison spent the day in a state of controlled tension, maintaining his cover at the CIA station, filing routine reports, attending a pointless briefing on Soviet communications protocols. His colleagues noticed nothing unusual. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to keep his face neutral, even as his mind ran through every possible failure scenario. By evening, he'd returned to his apartment, told his wife he had late operational duties, and prepared for midnight. He arrived at the western side of the Oberbaumbrücke at 11:30, positioned in the shadows where he could observe without being immediately visible. The wall loomed in the darkness, 4 meters of concrete topped with barbed wire, illuminated by harsh floodlights that turned night into perpetual artificial day. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, manned by soldiers with orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross. This wasn't a border. It was a statement about what humans would do to control other humans. Morrison checked his watch. 11:45. Volkov should be moving into position on the eastern side now, making his way through the dark streets of East Berlin toward the designated location. There was no way to communicate, no way to confirm he'd received the message or was even still free. Morrison simply had to trust that Volkov would be there, that 3 days had been enough time, that the KGB hadn't already taken him. 11:58. Becker's team initiated the diversion. Shouting erupted near the checkpoint. the sound of breaking glass, flashlight beams swinging toward the disturbance. Morrison could see guards moving, distracted, converging on what appeared to be drunk workers fighting over some petty dispute. Then he saw movement on the eastern side. A figure running low, moving fast toward the wall. Volkov. But something was wrong. 3 more figures materialized from the shadows behind him. KGB agents, closing the distance, cutting off his escape route. The operation was compromised. They'd been waiting, watching, letting Volkov make his move so they could catch him in the act of defection. Volkov stopped running. Trapped between the wall and his pursuers, he stood motionless for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Morrison could hear Russian voices now, commands to surrender, the metallic sound of weapons being raised. This was how it ended. Not with extraction, but with arrest, torture, execution. And Morrison was helpless, separated by concrete and barbed wire and the absolute divide between 2 worlds at war. Then Volkov did something Morrison would never forget. Instead of surrendering, instead of accepting the inevitable, he turned and sprinted directly toward the wall, not toward the safe passage Becker had identified, but toward the highest, most exposed section, fully illuminated by floodlights. He was creating a spectacle, forcing the situation into public view, making it impossible for the Soviets to take him quietly. Morrison understood instantly. If Volkov could reach the wall in full view of Western observers, if he could make his escape attempt visible and dramatic, the Soviets might hesitate to shoot, fearing international consequences. It was desperate, probably suicidal, but it was the only chance left. And it gave Morrison a choice. He could stay hidden, stay safe, let events unfold without exposing himself. Or he could do something that violated every principle of intelligence work, something that would end his career and possibly his freedom. Morrison broke cover. He ran toward the wall from the western side, shouting in German at the top of his lungs, "American officer! Do not shoot! American officer present!" His presence changed the equation. Now there were witnesses, documentation, diplomatic complications. The KGB agents hesitated, confused by this reckless American exposing himself in a forbidden zone. In that moment of confusion, Volkov reached the wall and began climbing. The Soviets fired. Not at Volkov, at Morrison. Warning shots, trying to drive him back, but Morrison stayed visible, arms raised, making himself the international incident the Soviets desperately wanted to avoid during those tense Cold War months. Volkov reached the top. His hands were bleeding from barbed wire. He looked down at Morrison once, a look that contained gratitude, disbelief, and recognition that one man had kept his word when his entire government had said not to. Then he dropped into West Berlin. Morrison caught him. They ran together into the darkness, away from the wall, away from the searchlights, into the warren of West Berlin streets where Becker's car was waiting. Behind them, the shooting stopped. The Soviets wouldn't risk pursuing across the border. Not tonight. Not with an American officer as witness. They'd made it. Against every probability, against direct orders, against the cold calculus of intelligence work, they'd made it. But the consequences were only beginning.